Just a quick disclaimer, this experiment deals with high heat and toxic gases, so, you know, don't attempt this unless you have the proper safety measures and all that. You know what I mean. So today, we're making iron 2 sulfide. Okay, so iron sulfide, which is also known as ferrous sulfide, is a chemical compound that you get when you heat iron and sulfur together. The reaction itself is really simple. It's just iron plus sulfur makes iron sulfide. And iron sulfide itself is also pretty simple, just one iron and one sulfur atom. Well, technically, a scientist might say 1 mole of iron and 1 mole of sulfur, but whatever, that's irrelevant right now. So, anyway, what we're really dealing with here is iron 2 sulfide, as there are a few different kinds. The natural mineral compounds are the following: marcasite, pyrrhotite, gragite, troilite, maconite, and probably the most well-known, pyrite. Whew, I sure hope I pronounced all those correctly. Oh, and there's also one synthetic compound, iron 3 sulfide. So iron 2 sulfide is a solid. It can be a powder, but that's also solid. Yeah, whatever. So yeah, anyway, iron 2 sulfide is a dark, rocky sort of solid that is insoluble in water, just like most of the other iron and sulfur compounds. Alright, enough about the compound itself. Let's get on to how you make it. Now, about that disclaimer at the beginning of the video, I was serious. First of all, this reaction is highly exothermic and can easily get up to temperatures hot enough to melt metal. And secondly, during the reaction, some of the sulfur will react with the oxygen in the air, creating sulfur dioxide gas, which is really nasty if you breathe it in. So you definitely want to avoid that. And proper PPE is absolutely required. Alright, so now that we're actually done with that, we can finally get on to making it. So the only chemicals you really need for this are elemental iron and sulfur. It's much better to have them in a powder form, since they'll react much easier that way. It says iron filings, fine, but that is a blatant lie since it's just powder. Obviously. So you want to measure out the iron and the sulfur into 2 different beakers with a ratio of 7 to 4. That is, 4 grams of sulfur versus 7 grams of iron. Alright, so here I have the 7 grams of iron in one beaker, and the 4 grams of sulfur in the other beaker. And I'm just going to add them together. Pouring them back and forth like this is a much better way of mixing them together than a stir rod or a mortar and pestle, because it ensures that they won't just spontaneously react together, and you really wouldn't want that. Once they're fully mixed, you can carefully break up any clumps of sulfur with a stir rod if needed. So for this next step, I used a sheet of steel that I got at the hardware store a while back, but you could really use any surface that can withstand very high temperatures. Not glass or aluminum or anything like that, because they would shatter or melt under the extreme temperature. In this case, steel is clearly a much higher and more superior being. Now, even though the reaction itself does produce a ton of heat, it doesn't actually require a large amount of heat to get it started. You can ignite areas and start the reaction just with a match. For this first batch of iron 2 sulfide, I decided to heat it up on the metal with my little propane stove. Now fairly quickly you can see a large portion of it reacting already, melting and producing smoke. Now, like I said before, you want to steer well clear of these vapors and make sure you don't breathe them in, and protect yourself properly. I don't currently have access to a fume hood, however it was okay considering I did this outside on a windy day with a mask on, and it was also not a very large amount of iron sulfide. Unfortunately, I lost some of the footage of the main part of the reaction, but you can see here as it kind of draws to a close. It's not molten or bubbling anymore, but it's still smoking, and you can see that it's become a dark, flaky solid. To make sure the heat didn't go through the steel and burn the wooden table it was on, I let it cool down here on this iron chair, once the reaction was fully completed. Okay, so you can see close up here that it is very flaky and powdery, and has turned a dark brownish color. And it is very flat against the surface of the steel. With this little metal spatula thing, I scraped it off and put it into a test tube. It ended up not being quite as much as it looked because of how flat it was. I weighed it and found that the final amount was almost exactly 8 grams. After starting out with 11 grams, that gives me a yield of about 73%. It's not that great, but not quite as bad as I thought it was going to be, considering I definitely made a loss scraping it off the sheet of steel. And that some, of course, was lost during the reaction. In the test tube, you can see the reflective kind of areas where the iron sulfide was flat against the metal. And you can see that as a whole, it's actually quite powdery. Okay, so now it's time to scale it up. The beginning is just the same process over again, so I'm just going to show you guys the reaction. And you can see that it's a whole lot bigger than the first time. So for this run, I heated up a glass stir rod and pressed it against the iron and the sulfur, so that the heat of it kickstarts the reaction, kind of like the match did. In my opinion, this is the best way to react it because it looks way cooler. You can see how the reaction started when the glass stir rod touched down, and slowly spread out like a wave. Of course, this will make the reaction take significantly longer, since only that little ring kind of area around the reacted material is being reacted at any given time, if that makes any sense. And after a little bit, once the reaction has gotten started, you can take the glass stir rod out and it'll just continue on its own. This will eventually cover the entirety of the iron and sulfur, but you can speed it up by touching it multiple times with the stir rod if you want to. You can see the small amounts of fire and sparks that time. So yeah, I will let you guys watch it react, while I proceed to lower the audience retention by talking about iron sulfide for a while. So even though this reaction is pretty cool, iron sulfide itself can be useful. An example being that it reacts with sulfuric acid, producing a very poisonous gas called hydrogen sulfide. I don't really know why you'd want to produce a toxic gas like that, but to each his own. Anyway, it's also pyrophoric, meaning that you want to be really careful cutting it or grinding it into a powder or anything like that, because it could, in the air, just spontaneously catch on fire. So obviously, you want to avoid that happening if you don't know about it. Also, iron-sulfur compounds are a common component of waste rock from metal mines. And there are some basic statistical sort of things about iron-2 sulfide, such as the melting point being 1194 degrees Celsius, and the density being about 4.84 grams per milliliter, and also the molar mass being about 87.91 grams. But anyway, let's continue. Here the reaction is almost done, but you can see up close the reaction in real time. How it bubbles and how the wave slowly spreads out. It's strangely beautiful, actually. And here, much more close up, you can actually see the small bits of iron and sulfur reacting together at the edge of the wave, as it spreads out further. And you can also see more bubbles releasing the sulfur dioxide. Here you can see the kind of crusty, flaky surface of it, as the reaction's pretty much almost done. So this is the final amount that I got, in 2 test tubes. And you can see that, again, it's not quite as much as it looked on the sheet of metal, and relative to its size, it's actually quite dense. And yeah, that is the final product of iron 2 sulfide. So later I'll end up probably purifying it or cleaning it, since there were small amounts of unreacted sulfur and iron left, along with other trace stuff from the environment. But for now, that's for the future. So, it has been a while since I uploaded my first video, and with how weird everything is, it'll probably be a while to my next one. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. Consider leaving a like or subscribing if you like my content and want to see more of it in the future. And I hope you enjoyed the video. Bye.